When a woman is reduced to no more than her looks, why wouldn't she use them? Inez Milholland was born in 1886 in Brooklyn, New York. Her dad was a New York Tribune reporter and owned a very successful business. Her mom was a progressive thinker who introduced the kids to other cultures and intellectualism. Both supported reform, world peace, and civil rights for all. As you can imagine, from an early age and despite being wealthy, Inez learned compassion, humanity, to stand against corruption and marginalization, and to use her wealth and privilege for all people, not just the ones who owned golden toilets. So the family split their time between their New York and London homes. Inez graduated from the Kensington Secondary School in London, and she knew where she wanted to go for college. Except Vassar in the United States wouldn't accept the Kensington certificate. So Inez went to the Willard School for Girls in Berlin to get a more acceptable certificate. And finally, in 1905, she and her mom took a trip to Vassar, where Inez was finally allowed to take and passed the entrance exam. Hello, freshman year. Well, she was brilliant and she pushed herself so hard. But it wasn't all studying. She was also an actress and breathtakingly beautiful. Freshman year, she was the lead in Romeo and Juliet and was in several other productions during her years at Vassar. She also joined groups, like the Current Topics Club, the German Club, and the debate team. But it wasn't just that either, because she was also an athlete. Basketball, tennis, golf, and the captain of the field hockey team. In her sophomore year, she broke the school's shot put record. In junior year, she won the College Cup for Best All-Around Athlete. Still not everything, because the role she considered most important was activist. You really should have seen that one coming. I told you about her parents. The summer after her sophomore year, she took a trip to London, where she met one Emmeline Pankhurst. She was called radical and militant because she stopped asking and started fighting for women's rights, especially the vote. Inez took everything she learned from Emmeline and the other suffragists back to Vassar. She got to work on bringing awareness and other women to the fight, which right quick pissed off James Monroe Taylor. He was a Baptist minister and the fourth president of Vassar. Well, he didn't want any of that suffrage shit at his school. It would poison things. It was his job to protect women. So he wouldn't allow prominent women's movement leaders to speak at the school, despite that they'd done it at other schools. He outright banned suffrage meetings. Well, he had a justification, of course. Vassar's mission was not to reform society, but to educate women. Clearly, he was too arrogant to realize that educated women reform society. Fucking duh. Educated women are also resourceful. Oh, she respected his ban, and instead held the suffrage meetings across the street in a small cemetery, with about 56 of her closest friends. She and Harriet Stanton Blatch, another leading suffragist, had organized the first meeting. They had a bright yellow banner. Come, let us reason together. And the Vassar Votes for Women Club was born, and kept their meetings off campus. In her senior year, Inez convinced good old Jimmy Boy to allow a debate on suffrage and to prove the validity of women's issues. He had agreed so long as no faculty spoke. Except they did. And he got pissed and doubled down on his ban, which she again respected. But she did find a way to make sure he never forgot her. Just before graduation, she set up students in several rooms around campus, who silently, with posters and room settings, sat in protest of his dumbass policies, while, quote, hordes of invited students filed by. You don't fuck with a brilliant woman. Inez graduated Vassar in 1909 and applied for law school at Yale, Harvard, and Columbia. All rejected her because she lacked a peener. Because, yeah, the little head, that's where all the good decisions live. Not one to surrender, she applied and was accepted at the New York University School of Law. And in 1912, she graduated with that law degree. Okay, her activism. That is where most folks pick up the story. And no, we ain't putting it down. Her first public speaking appearance literally stopped a presidential parade. William Howard Taft was campaigning in New York, and she started yelling through a megaphone from a building above, encouraging him to realize that women are people too. Quote, hundreds of men broke rank to see and hear her. I'm pretty sure it was mostly see, because it wasn't long before she was called the most beautiful suffragist. Yes, because remember, that's the only thing worth remembering about a woman. Anyway, while she was at NYU, she also got arrested for protesting the 1911 fire that unalived several hundred women working in a clothing factory. Let's just say they got locked in and weren't let out. So I'm pretty sure you can figure out why she was protesting. For the rest of her life, she fought hard for better wages and hours, and safety for women workers. Probably her most famous appearance came in 1913. Woodrow Wilson was going to be inaugurated on March 4th, but she had helped organize an event to happen the day before. So on March 3rd in Washington, D.C., 30,000 gathered for the National American Woman Suffrage Parade. Inez, looking, quote, confident and imposing, sat atop a large, impatient white horse and took her place at the head of the parade. She wore a crown and long white cape, the symbolic herald. Now, like most women, she detested the focus on her looks. But that day, she used her looks to bring national attention to the cause, including that handy-dandy, impatient white horse. Because allegedly, a bunch of drunk dudes tried to disrupt things. So she, quote, turned her horse into the rampaging crowd and subdued them. I said imposing. While she never gave up on the fight for the right to vote, it wasn't the only thing she fought for. After graduation, remember, 1912, she was admitted to the bar in New York, then accepted a position with a New York firm, handling criminal and divorce cases for women. She also ended up investigating conditions at Sing Sing prison. It was a maximum security prison, and women weren't allowed to talk directly to prisoners. But she never backed down and got to talk to them. One story said she wanted to understand what it was to be them, so had herself handcuffed to a prisoner. In talking to them, she learned the truth. One example, prisoners were expected to be completely silent. If they weren't, they suffered whippings, or worse. She believed prisoners deserved humanity as well. She spoke fervently to judges and other officials for court system and prison reform. She led a lifelong campaign against capital punishment, was involved with the Women's Trade Union League and the National Child Labor Committee to fight for better wages and hours for those women in department stores and factories, and to get the kids out of them. She advocated for equal rights for all, regardless of gender or color. She also traveled to Europe during World War I in hopes of helping to negotiate an end to the war. While there, she briefly worked as a reporter. Meant she was a war correspondent, but she couldn't be impartial, so she gave it up. She dreamt of world peace, not world wars. At all turns, she used her wealth and influence for humanity, bringing attention to the mistreatment of women and children in marginalized communities, because they're human beings. By 1916, she was one of the highest profile members of the women's movement. She, quote, electrified audiences. With that electrification and her looks, she went on a grueling speaking tour to 12 Western states, against both family and medical advice. Her health hadn't been great, but she never backed down. During a speech in Los Angeles, she collapsed on stage. She was rushed to the hospital, and over the following weeks, received several blood transfusions and other treatments. Her diagnosis was pernicious anemia. That is an autoimmune condition. It prevents the absorption of B12, which you kind of need. That results in fewer red blood cells to carry oxygen through the body, and synthetic B12 didn't exist. Inez Milholland succumbed to her condition on November 25, 1916. She was 30. She was called a martyr for the cause, and has been honored in several ways that have nothing to do with her looks, including on Broadway. She fought harder than many of her contemporaries for equal rights, especially the right to vote. But she never got to exercise that right. The 19th Amendment, you know, the one that gave women the right to vote, wasn't ratified until August 18, 1920. In case you didn't know, people of color were forced to wait way, way longer. It's barely more than 100 years later, and our rights are being threatened again. In fact, we've already lost a major one. So, you and me, we got a job to do, regardless of which side we're on. This November, I'll see you at the ballot box.